So chapters 5 and 6 are the last in the historical narrative first half of Daniel. The last half in chapters 7 through 12 are Daniel's visions of the future. So we're going to be taking a look at chapter 5 tonight and all of chapter 6 this coming Sunday. You know, chapter 6, it's another one of those amazing stories in the book of Daniel. It's Daniel chilling with the big cats. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at on Sunday. As we come to chapter 5, time has moved on from the end of chapter 4. In fact, about 25 years have passed. That 25 years saw a lot of turmoil in the Babylonian court. Now, I'm going to ask Mike to go ahead and put up this slide. I wanted to give you a little bit of a visual here of the kings, the emperors, if you will, of the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar we're familiar with. It's who we've been reading about. He was actually, in history, Nebuchadnezzar II. He reigned from 605 to 562 BC. He was followed by his son, Merodach, from 562 to 560. So he's reigned about 2.5 years. He's known to us in the Bible as evil Merodach, but historians refer to him as Marduk. He, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was deposed in a coup by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Neriglissar, who served from 560 to 556, so only about 3.5 years. He was followed by his son, Labash Marduk, who really just only served for a few months in 556. And then he was deposed by another son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar named Nabonidus. And he served from 556 to 539. Now here's the thing. It was right at this time that the Persians emerged. The Babylonians had conquered the entire area. They had even conquered most of Medo-Persia. But the Persians, they really come on, they really resurge, and they start to push back against the Babylonians and start taking away their territory. So Nabonidus, he's out with the Babylonian army, meeting the Persians in several different battles. He was rarely in Babylon. And so what he did is he appointed his son, Belshazzar, as co-regent in the capital. It was then that the Medo-Persian Empire, under its amazing unifier and probably the greatest military commander of the Persian Empire, their first real emperor, Cyrus the Great, he decided to flex his muscles and take on the big bad boy Babylon. And so he's now defeated Nabonidus, the king, who has fled to another city, and he's hiding out, leaving Belshazzar, his son, in charge of Babylon. We read in verse 1, Belshazzar, the king, again, he's co-regent with his father, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. So the mention here of Belshazzar as king of Babylon, listen, this is one of the reasons critics have assigned the book of Daniel to a much later date. And the reason why is they said this, for years and years and years, they said, there's no record of a Belshazzar as the king of Babylon. This is made up. If this had been historical, if this had been written at the time it's professed to be written at, they would have never put that guy's name in there. They would have put Nabonidus in there. And so this was one of their arguments. And why do the critics say Daniel couldn't have been written when it was? Because it speaks so amazingly about the future. And then history happened, and much of it fulfilled exactly as Daniel foretold. And so they don't believe that somebody can foretell the future with that accuracy. So it must have been written much later and only made to look like it was written during the time of Daniel. And that was the way the critics went for years and years, for decades really, and saying Daniel was written very late. Well, hold on, Dr. Critic, Professor Skeptic. Let the archaeologists do a little digging before you conclude the Bible's all a myth. It turns out in 1854, when archaeologists were working in southern Iraq, they found clay cylinders that were 4 inches long with cuneiform writing on them. It was a record commemorating the rebuilding of a temple, and they contained a prayer for the long life and the good health of King Nabonidus and his son, Belshazzar. And since then, many more such clay tablets have been found. bearing his name. As I said, during Nabonidus' reign, he's away on military campaigns, trying to contain the Persian threat. While he's gone, he appoints Belshazzar, his son, his co-regent in Babylon, which was the normal course of action we know at this time. When a king goes off on a military campaign he may lose his life on, does he want to leave the kingdom without some kind of a ruler? No, he appoints someone to act as a surrogate until he can return. So history now knows, this is established, this is just in regular history accounts, that Belshazzar and Nabonidus were co-regents for 14 years. As we come to chapter 5, the Persians, listen, they've now conquered Nabonidus. The main body of the Babylonian army has been defeated. And the Persians now are laying siege to the city of Babylon. While the main Babylonian forces defeated, the Persian king Cyrus knew all he had to do was to finish off the capital, and that's the end of the Babylonian Empire. But remember what we saw Sunday. Is anybody going to break through the walls of Babylon? They're 100 feet tall. They're 25 feet thick. That's the outer wall. 75 feet inside of that is another wall that creates a killing zone between them. And this siege cannot outlast the supplies inside the city, because remember, the city has a wall that's 56 miles around. They have 20 years worth of stored food in there, and the Euphrates River flows right through the middle of it. So they can outlast any siege, because how long can a siege last out there? It can't last 20 years. And so we have a problem, don't we? Well, history tells us that it is October 12th of 539 BC. It's a Babylonian religious holiday. And instead of canceling the celebration because of the siege, and rather than mourning the defeat of his father's forces, Belshazzar decides to throw a kegger. It's all swagger and defiance with the enemy outside the walls. You see what he's doing? Hey, we have to try to keep up morale inside the city, right? We're surrounded by the enemy. The real king is now exiled, if you will. We don't really have any military powers left that can deal with these enemies that have laid siege to us. But we're chilling in here. We know that we're going to outlast this thing. Let's just have a party. It's a religious holiday, so let's just all get together and let's party. It's swagger and defiance. Belshazzar thinks that this makes him a tough guy. I'm not going to let the Persians out there bother me. Let's party. And we compare this to what happened to Jerusalem when the Babylonians laid siege to it. Remember that the Babylonians had laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah the prophet had pleaded with them, in Jerusalem, don't resist. They're God's judgment, open up. But they wouldn't. And so it was terrible what happened inside the city. And Jeremiah had said, hey, listen, don't worry about the Babylonians, because the Jews were freaked out. How is it that God would allow a pagan enemy that has nothing to do with him to come and defeat God's people? And Jeremiah said, listen, don't worry about it. If they are arrogant, one day what they're doing to you will happen to them. Well, here they are. Now the Persians have laid siege outside their walls. Verse 2. While he tasted the wine, and when it says tasted there, this isn't a royal wine tasting. It's not like he's got his little wine snifter, and they pour a little bit of wine in there and he, kind of tastes it. He's 3 sheets to the wind, all right? Drinking a lot of wine. He's well into it is the point. So while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar, and let's just pause right there. Nebuchadnezzar was his grandfather on his mother's side. There's no word in Aramaic for grandfather. It's literally the word ancestor, and you just know who it is based on the history, on the context. Okay, so we know that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather on his mom's side. So, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. You get the picture? They're having this party, they're deep into the wine, and he gets this idea, as they're all enjoying this feast that they're having and yucking it up, and you can be sure they're telling their jokes, and hey, bring those vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. Yeah, that stuff that was used to worship Yahweh, which we defeated. Bring that, and let's drink out of those. You got it? Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. The Babylonian throne room where this took place has been unearthed by archaeology. It's 175 feet long and 60 feet wide. It could accommodate the crowd that's mentioned here. And along one of the walls, there was a large niche where the throne was slightly elevated above the room where the king would sit. And so picture that scene. They're enjoying the feast. The wine is flowing freely. Belshazzar and his guests have had too much. He wants to impress his guests that he's not afraid. But the Persians encamped outside the walls, and so he sends his servants to collect the sacred vessels looted from Jerusalem's temple by his grandfather. Now, what Belshazzar does here was unthinkable. Listen, it was unthinkable even to the Babylonian mind. Let's think about this for a minute. We've been studying now in Daniel, so maybe you'll remember, what's the chief of the Babylonian gods? What's his name? Marduk. Sometimes they refer to him as Bel. Marduk is his name. Now, Marduk, in their thinking, remember in the ancient mind, the winner of ancient warfare was whoever had the stronger god. So Babylon has defeated Israel, Judah. So Marduk is stronger than who? Yahweh, right? But Yahweh's still a God. And the vessels that they've taken as, remember when we were back in chapter 1, it says that Nebuchadnezzar took some of the vessels and the nobles back to Babylon. What did the vessels represent? Trophies of Marduk's victory. And remember where Nebuchadnezzar put them? In the temple of his God. They're like trophies. So now they go get those trophies, which are dedicated to who? Marduk and Yahweh, and let's party with them? Do you understand that even in the Babylonian mind, this is really stupid? Like, yeah, Marduk, we're going to use your stuff. But why does he do it? Because he's drunk. Do I even need to talk about that? Don't many of us have personal experience? Like, you don't even, Pastor, don't even need to go there. We know. Just move on. This is what happens. When you're under the influence, you do stupid things. And that's what he's doing. Belshazzar is horribly messed up in his sense of propriety. His city is ringed by enemies. Babylon's army has been vanquished. His father, the king, is on the run. And what's he doing? He's partying it up. Drunk. Tweaking the noses of both Marduk and Yahweh. This is not going to go well. Verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. The gold and silver speak of economic prosperity. Bronze and iron of military strength, wood and stone of Babylon's defenses. They're toasting the idols from cups used in the temple of Jerusalem to worship God. Translated that into terms maybe that we can understand, using these cups dedicated to the service of Yahweh, and they're toasting idols. Let's just translate that into modern terms. A satanic mass in a church. They got ripped and sloppy on communion wine. They sang praise choruses that we sing to Jesus to Buddha or Krishna or Moroni. We think of those things, that's just wrong. And that's what they're doing. History's seen people commit some truly heinous blasphemies, and yet God has been silent. We know that. People are committing blasphemies around us every day now, and God seems to be silent. But sometimes, in the face of some blasphemies, God decides to show up, and this is one of them. Verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him. Well, I guess so. So that the joints of his hips were loosed and his knees knocked against each other. Belshazzar lost control of his body. He began to shiver violently, a common reaction in cases of extreme fear. You lose control of your body. Now, what caused this reaction? He's witnessing something that's obviously supernatural. Across the room from where he's sitting, so you picture a 175 feet long wall, right? 60 feet this way. It's a huge hall. There's pillars in it, of course, supporting it. He's up in his little raised dais over here, and he looks across the wall 60 feet over there, and here's a hand, and it's writing on the wall. Belshazzar's reaction gives us a clue to what kind of a guy he was. Rather than the tough guy he wanted to project, he's a coward. He knew that what he was doing was risky and wrong, but he assumed that he would get away with it because he had already gotten away with a lot. Kings get away with a lot that others don't, and they can't. Thus the phrase, it's good to be king. The king of Babylon was especially immune from consequences because, as we have stated in other studies, they were absolute despots. They were answerable to no one. Their command was law. The minute it left their mouth, it was done. And there was plenty of people around ready to do it because it would ingratiate them to the king. And so he could say, I want all the wise men in the land killed. And they started dying, just like that. As with Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar now realizes that though he answers to no one on earth, there's one in heaven with whom he must give account. He gets called on the risk that he took in calling for and drinking from the vessels from God's temple. And the problem is, he has no ideas what the words mean that he sees written on the wall. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be third ruler in the kingdom. Note that phrase, third ruler in the kingdom. Hold on. If we are just imagining, right, like the critics said, that this was falsely put in, that there was no Belshazzar and that he's the king, who would he say would be, what would be the rank of the person that could do this? Third? No, what? Second. But it is historically accurate. Why? Because Belshazzar can't make someone second because there's already his dad in him. The second position would actually be the third position because there's already two in the number one spot. You see? Just one little piece of evidence here of the historical accuracy of the record. Hidden for years because archaeologists simply hadn't found a record for the ruler Belshazzar. But ever since 1854, now we know there was. I just love the way that God keeps proving himself and his word true. Verse 8, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. So try as they might, even with the incentive of this reward, the wise men were not able to even read the writing, let alone explain what it meant. It's likely the words were in, well, if God is writing it, what language is he likely to be writing in? English, right? Hebrew. What do they speak? Aramaic. And it's likely that the writing was probably, it's in Hebrew, and even though they spoke Aramaic, their characters were drawn from ancient Akkadian, cuneiform Akkadian. So, so that's why they can't read it. It's a foreign language to them, foreign letters. Verse 9, then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. Okay, so there's a message that's been written on the wall, and he's king. Do you understand? He realizes there's a message there. I need to know what it is. But none of my guys, no one can, we don't know what it is. So he really starting to get troubled. His countenance was changed and his lords were astonished. So you know the sound effect when something comes to a screeching stop? Okay, picture that here. Because they've been partying, they're snockered. All of a sudden there's this writing and they're like, wait, what's going on? And then they bring in these guys and they look. They're all taking their cue and their clue from Belshazzar, and they see him, and it's get even worse now. The wise men come in and we don't know. And he's like freaking out. Buzzkill, right? Okay, can I use a kind of, okay. Those of you, before you came to Christ and you partied, and you were, not in a right state of mind. Maybe you were driving home, and you look up in the rearview mirror and the lights from the police car are flashing. Do you not sober up immediately, right? It's like, what? Wow, that was quick. All of a sudden, I'm sober. I've never done that, of course, because it's never happened to me. That's what's going on here. And then, okay, we're all sober now. Look at the king. He's freaking out. If anybody has a reason to not freak out, it's the king. He has absolute power and control, and he's freaking out. If he's freaking out, everyone sobered up right quick. Verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banqueting hall. So this was the queen. This is Nabonidus' wife, Belshazzar's mother. She's not been a part of their foolish revelry. She was most likely mourning the absence of her husband, wondering if she's ever going to see him again. Now, someone brings her a report about the strange goings-on in the royal hall, and so she goes there. What's going on? As a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, she remembers some of the most important moments in his life during his rule, and so the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There's a man in your kingdom in whom this is the spirit of the holy God. Do you remember Sunday? How did Nebuchadnezzar refer to Daniel 3 times? In you dwells the spirit of the holy God. And she remembers that title and applies it now to Daniel. And in the days of your father, again, that's grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, let now Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So Daniel is a senior at this point. He's in a kind of retirement. And though a well-known public figure during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the later kings had their own staff, their own advisors. This is what kings do, right? You have a king, he's got his advisors, and then the new guy comes in and he's like, yeah, get rid of those guys. I want my own guys in there. And so he brings in his own guys. Well, this is now, a few iterations away from Nebuchadnezzar. And so this guy Belshazzar, he's got his own set of advisors and has forgotten all about Daniel. Out with the old, in with the new is a kind of thought. And the queen says that Daniel, he's still around. And he has quite the reputation back in the day for his amazing skill at solving just these kinds of problems. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who was one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." So the queen's mention of Daniel jogs Belshazzar's memory. Oh yeah, that's right. He was one of those young Jewish guys that Gramps brought from Jerusalem and trained. Oh yeah, I remember that guy. I wonder if maybe Belshazzar began to connect the pieces, right? Hold on. Daniel's Jewish. He's from Jerusalem. Oh, and we were just drinking out of vessels that we took from, maybe he's can help out with that. Verse 15, "Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing." Because as Daniel listens, he's probably thinking, here we go again. These wise guys are good for nothing. It seems like each time they're brought in, they can't help. So they have to call for me. It doesn't take Daniel long to figure out what's up. Verse 16, "And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be third ruler in the kingdom." It's the same reward that he had promised the other guys. But Daniel's not interested. Verse 17, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, 'Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation.'" Guys, listen, this is such an important insight. Bear with me a little as we take some time to unpack something that I think is vital. Daniel had faithfully served in the Babylonian court for a long time, and he's in a kind of retirement. He must be, right, because over here is not even really doing anything, and he has to be brought out and brought before the king. When there was a need, he didn't refuse. He offered to do what he could do. But he's living now as a simple, humble prophet of God, very likely as a leader of the Jewish community that's there in exile in Babylon. In the years that he had served Nebuchadnezzar, he drew an income as was right and proper for being employed by the king. But as his story and reputation make clear, Daniel was a man of integrity who never used his position to his own advantage. Though he was chief of the wise men and governor of the entire province of Babylon, he never schemed to enrich himself. He was what a person in his position ought to be, a servant. When in his prime, he never used the gifts that God gave him to elevate himself. God certainly elevated him, but he never sought it. So much of the book of Daniel illustrates the truth that those who exalt themselves are humbled, while those who humble themselves are exalted. Daniel never aspired to be great, only faithful. And so God made him great in a way that we still honor him today. We are here studying his book. But Daniel never grandstanded. He never prostituted his amazing gifts and talent. He never angled to profit from them. Yes, he accepted fair, just income, but only so that he could remain faithful. And here he is now, coming out of retirement for an encore performance. And like the offer of big bucks to the 70-year-old rockers to do a reunion tour, Belshazzar offers to pay him handsomely if he'll climb back into the seer mode and play the old hits one more time. And Daniel says, no thanks. I'll tell you what the words mean, but you can keep your stuff. How we could wish that all God's servants had the same integrity and humility and faithfulness. There are some amazingly gifted people who can preach and teach and sing and act and lead. And like Daniel, they seem uniquely positioned to do an amazing work in and for the kingdom of God at a specific moment in history. But instead of following Daniel's example of humble service, they accept the celebrity that the industry of churchianity heaps on them. Instead of saying with Daniel, keep your rewards, They have an agent who fields requests for their services. Their fee is between $5,000 and $50,000, and the writer is 50 pages long and includes which bottled water they want and where to get a quinoa and kale smoothie. And I'm not kidding. Because we've contacted some of those people and asked them if they would come. And their agent has sent us the pack of what they require. And so it goes in the round file. You know, they're gifted by God to serve him by serving his people, but then they charge the people to be blessed by the gift. It's my opinion that the whole Christian celebrity industry is an abomination. Amen. Those who are engaged in full and part-time ministry, of course they are worthy of a wage. That's Bible. Luke chapter 10, verse 7 and 1 Timothy 5:18 both say that the worker is worthy of his wages. But friends, there's a big difference between a reasonable income and paying someone for their star power. We are here to glorify God and build his kingdom, not to glorify a religious celebrity and build their empire. Well, Daniel goes on, verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whoever he wished, he put down. So if there was any doubt about the absolute power of the Babylonian kings, let that put it to rest. As Daniel begins here, I wonder if Belshazzar said to himself, oh, here we go. The old guy's going to talk about the glory of the good old days. You know, back when he was at court and everything was better. But a turn down nostalgia avenue is not what Daniel is doing here. He was recounting the lessons Belshazzar's grandfather had learned. He had all power among mortals and came to assume that he had all power, period. As he ends verse 19, I'm sure that Daniel's voice changes as he drills a stare right at Belshazzar and says, verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne and they took his glory from him. And then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whom he chooses. Anybody here Sunday? Does it sound familiar? Amen. Daniel knows what's ahead for Belshazzar. He knows. He doesn't have long to rule. All the power he thought he possessed that sparked the mega kegger is about to evaporate. The lesson Nebuchadnezzar learned there at the end of verse 21, that God raises up who he wills, Belshazzar is about to be schooled in. He was a little man in a big position. He was the classic big hat, no cattle guy. He's a punk playing at Prince. And that's why he throws this party. He's so insecure about his future, he thought pretending everything was fine would make it so. These were the actions of a fool, a pretender, a fraud. And we see who he really was when the hand appeared. He's a scaredy cat. His knees knock. He screams like a little girl, "Get the magicians!" One of the premier duties of any leader is to tell and to deal with the truth. The danger leaders face is pride, which blinds them to truth. Pride paints a picture of things that as we want them to be, rather than as they really are. As the petulant ruler of Babylon, Belshazzar had no one who dared tell him the truth. He allowed his position to go to his head and inflate his pride. He wanted to be a big, tough guy who'd see the city through the storm called Persia. And so he called this party and the foolishness of pretending that he was on an equal footing with God. That's what pride does. not just to Babylonians, but to Oxnardians. That's what pride does. It does it to all of us, not just kings. It whispers the same lie the devil told Eve. We are our own gods. We can do our own thing, our own way, according to our own will. Pride is the fiction that we don't need God, that we're self-sufficient, independent beings who owe God nothing. And the truth is we owe God everything. Amen. Every breath is his gift. Amen. Some of you already have heard this, you already know it. For those of you that haven't, just think of this. You say something like, even every breath belongs to God, and it does. You all know what atoms are. You know what an atom is? Your body is made up of atoms. And at the center of every atom is a nucleus, and inside that nucleus are protons. And protons are positively charged. What happens when you take two positive charges and you try to put them together? What happens? They repel each other, right? Difference attracts, like repels. What holds the center of an atom together? Because it's all protons and neutrons. What's holding it together? Because physics tells us it should fly apart. What's holding it together? It's a mystery. Talk to a physicist. Ask them what's holding the center of an atom, every atom together, and they'll go, stuff. Okay. For years they called it nuclear glue. I'm not kidding. What is it made of? Yeah, we don't know. What was that? Never mind. Colossians says that all things consist, are held together, adhere by the power of his word. God spoke and the universe stood forth, and the day is coming when he will say it's done, and it says the elements will melt like a fervent heat. We won't need the creation anymore. We will have a new heavens and a new earth. This whole physical dimension will no longer be needed. It's all going to dissolve, as Peter says. The elements will melt with a fervent heat. Melt, the word literally means to untie. It's all going to fly apart because it's not going to be needed anymore. What's holding it together right now? Jesus. We need him for everything. He's holding you together. You say, God's holding you together. You say, yeah, I mean that literally, physically. He's holding you together physically. The very atoms of your being are being held together by him. When they popped the corks and drank the wine, their physical drunkenness is just a symptom of their spiritual inebriation they had entered long before. Listen to the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. I say through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. He contrasts pride and sobriety. Isn't that interesting? The contrast between pride and sobriety. To be sober means to be free of anything that clouds the mind, to be clear-headed. Nothing is as deadly as the intoxicant of pride. So Daniel rehearsed Belshazzar's grandfather's great lesson about pride and humility, and how Nebuchadnezzar came out the other side converted to faith in God. Surely Nebuchadnezzar hoped that he'd learn what would be passed on to others through his proclamation there at the end of chapter 4. But Belshazzar hadn't learned. Verse 22, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you've not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, many, many tekel upharsin. So Daniel translates the words from whatever language they were, probably Hebrew, into Aramaic. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of each word, many. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, which is the root of the word Upharsin. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Many means numbered, as in the sense of something being counted out or counted down. The word's used twice, meaning that the number of days were set for the Babylonians, and that number is up. Tekel means weighed, as in scales, where something is compared to a standard. Upharsin means divided, because Belshazzar's line was now going to be forever divided from Babylon's throne. So this is God's judgment, the announcement of God's judgment of Belshazzar. The Neo-Babylonian Empire is, listen, done. This night. Power now passes to the Medo-Persian alliance led by Cyrus the Great. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. When the king ordered his attendants to bestow these rewards he'd promised on Daniel, Daniel can't refuse them. Please understand that. He can't. But he didn't want them. He likely, as soon as he leaves the king's presence, he takes them off, probably just gives them away. What's interesting is how quickly all this happened. Verse 30, look at that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Here's how it happened. The Persian army had surrounded Babylon. Their leader, as I said, was the brilliant King Cyrus, also known to history as Cyrus the Great. He devised a way to take the dominating fortress that was Babylon. He knew they would never be able to breach the walls. It was just not possible. And they couldn't keep a siege on long enough to outlast the supplies in the city. And so Cyrus applied a principle: use the enemy's strength against them. One of Babylon's greatest assets was the Euphrates River, which formed a moat around the outer wall and flowed through the heart of the city through low gates in the wall. The Babylonians understood this was a potential access point for an enemy, so even inside the city, so you get picture this, it's a square, as we mentioned. Try to picture it, 14 miles per side, 56 miles all the way around. And the river is flowing through it, and they knew that an enemy might be able to come in through those gates if for whatever reason the water level lowered, like a drought or whatever, maybe an army could swim through. And so on the inside of the city, along the river, they constructed walls there too, with gates in them for people to be able to go down and draw water. So the idea was, hey, listen, if an enemy ever comes up, we'll just make sure the gates on the inside of the city, along the walls along the river, are protected as well. Cyrus stationed some of his best troops at the spot where the river ran under the walls, so where it went into the city and where it came out of the city. And of course, the Babylonians are on the wall. They're looking down there and they're saying, well, okay, but they can't get in. And here's what they did. He started this project way upstream beyond where the watchmen on the top of the walls could see. I think it's about 8 miles north that they wouldn't be able to see anymore, the way that the contours of the land were. And he started a diversion project on the river Euphrates and dug a channel next to the river over to a lake. And on this night, he sent the message to the engineers to break the last dike of water so that the water of the river would flow into this channel that they had made, blocked the riverbed itself, so the water now gets diverted into the lake. So now the water drops really quickly. And remember, what was this night? What was it for the Babylonians? It was a religious festival. So the water drops. He sends these troops that go through the wall now because they can get through, they can march in. Now, but they're inside the city, but they've got the walls alongside the river, right? But no one's guarding the gates. Why? Because they're all partying. It's a religious festival. They went in, the Persians, took the city, bloodless. But of course, Belshazzar, he ends up dead. They kill him. But the Persians were just able to march into the city, and who are these guys? Well, they're the new rulers. And overnight, the Babylonian Empire fell because they took the city. Verse 31, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So skeptics have long used this verse as their supreme case for why Daniel was a forgery. Because history is clear that it was the great Persian king Cyrus who conquered Babylon. The Persian king Darius didn't rule until a few years later. And so commentators go to great length providing different solutions, and they're simply not necessary. There's a good example of the sometimes not so helpful placement of chapters and verses. Look at what comes next in chapter 6. Look at what it says, chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And then we're into the story of Daniel and the lions that we'll take a look at this coming Sunday. The last verse of chapter 5 belongs with chapter 6. The Persians took over Babylon. King Belshazzar was killed, and eventually Darius becomes king. What follows in chapter 6 takes place when he is 62. Chapter 5 records the fulfillment of Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. Do you remember the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream? Can you remember it's a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and then legs of iron. Very good, you guys, real good. So, and remember what Daniel said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, but after you comes another kingdom represented by the silver and those arms that we saw, Medo-Persian Empire. And so we're seeing here the fulfillment of that. As we end, let's be careful to draw out of our study an important principle about moderation. I again read from Romans 12, verse 3, where Paul says, I say through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. We must be sober-minded at all times, and not just from the effects of alcohol or pride. Friends, listen, we need to stay clear of any influence that could distort reality. To be sober-minded, please hear me. To be sober-minded means more than to not drink. We've already looked at how sobriety can relate to the issue of pride as well, because it really distorts how we perceive things. But aren't there other ways that our thinking can get filled with something that makes us distort reality? How about anger? Are we clear-headed when we're raging? No. How about ambition? How about depression? Any emotion that takes over our thoughts. In 1 Timothy 3, when Paul gives the list of qualifications for an elder, he says that the elder must be, and I just want to pick a few of them. Listen, an elder, meaning a spiritually mature person, temperate, sober-minded, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy, not covetous, not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into condemnation. The elder isn't just an older person. An elder is mature, spiritually mature. And the fact is, maturity does take time to develop. Maturity does take time to develop, but time itself does not guarantee maturity. Can I get an amen? There are some 25-year-olds who are far more emotionally and spiritually mature than some 50-year-olds. Time alone does not mean maturity. It's how we use time. The common theme for the criteria for elders is the idea that the spiritually mature is sober. They're clear-headed. The spiritually mature has a mind that's renewed by God's word and fueled by God's Spirit. They make moral choices that safeguard a clear head. They're on the lookout for anything that would distort reality and cause them to depart from what's true about God, themselves, and the world. The key to this sobriety is an important 10-letter word: moderation. This is one of the main themes and messages of the book of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. Neither the ascetic nor the hedonist are right. The proper path through life is neither abstinence nor indulgence, it's moderation. It's enjoying the pleasures that God has built into creation at the time and in the portion and fashion that He wills us to enjoy them. God gave us food, and it's good. God gave us drink, and it's good. God gave us sex, and it's good. All these things are good when they are used in the manner that God intends us to use them, but don't use them that way, and they ruin life, they destroy life, they take life from us. Emotions are good. They bring tremendous richness to life. But God intends emotions to be a reaction and a responder to right choices, not an initiator of them. We do not make choices because an emotion is driving them. The emotions are intended to be rewards for right choices. And too many humans have flipped that around. They make choices based on how they feel instead of choices based on what is true and right and good. And then enjoying the reward that comes from that and the emotions that come of joy and satisfaction. Don't aim at joy. Don't aim at happiness. Don't make decisions to be happy. Make choices that glorify God, and happiness will come. But if you pursue happiness, you'll never find it. Not real happiness, not real joy.